In every war, you need to be alert concerning the enemy's camp. Now, I know that wars are hoaxes. That doesn't mean that there are no conflicts. The wars are hoaxes, but the individual or local conflicts are real. And these hoaxes called war are used to regulate and steer those local and individual conflicts to achieve the end of the world's leaders. You get what I'm saying here? So conflicts exist, duh, of course, but wars themselves are fake. For example, you had the Vietnam War, which was a hoax, but the fights in Vietnam were real because people thought that there was a real conflict between the United States and the northern part of Vietnam, even though there was no real conflict. It was just hoax. But the soldiers that died really died, and the civilians in Vietnam that died due to the conflict, they really died. So the trauma is real, but the conflict, the war, I'm saying the war itself was a hoax. I hope this resonates with you, and I made videos talking about how they conduct these hoaxes called wars, so watch those videos. In this video, I want to explain the following. In every war situation, there is a camp that wants to hold on to something. Okay? For example, you had let me give a good example. In the end of the 19th century, you had, in what they call the Balkan area, you had the Croatians, the Serbians, and also Slovenians. You had three groups that collided together, but those groups wanted to have their own states. And you had Serbians that wanted to get rid of the Emperor of Austria. So there was a conflict over there. But it was not a war, because remember, all wars are hoaxes. But there was conflict, there was dissatisfaction within the Serbian population against the Austrian Emperor. So the Serbians, at least the ones that wanted to advance in getting their goals met, they want to separate from the Austro-Hungarian Empire. What did they do? They studied the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Because from their point of view, the Austro-Hungarian regime was their enemy, because it hindered their goal from having their own free state run by Serbians. So what happened was, those Serbians examined how the Austrians and Hungarians did their thing. Even though the Austrians and Hungarians were not fighting the Serbians were fighting the Austrians and Hungarians, because they perceived them as the cause of their misery. And it doesn't even matter whether it was realistic or not. In the world, this is how it goes. People often want enemies to fight so they can feel relief, so they can feel validated. This happens on a group level all the time. But when you have a group that needs this group validation, and therefore they are creating this enemy, the one they target as an enemy is in danger. Okay? So in daily life, if you have a group of people, whether it's at work or at college or wherever, and they make you the scapegoat, you are in danger. Even though you are not in a fight with them, they choose to be in a fight with you for private or some other reasons that they can't account for. So when you are in a war-like situation, it's important to know who your antagonists are, and it's important to know how they do stuff. Now, in the end of 19th century, during the end of 19th century, there were some issues from the Serbian side towards the Austrians and Hungarians, but it never got out of hand. Later, in the early 20th century, the wizards of this world used this contention from the Serbians against the Austrians and Hungarians to initiate World War I. That's why they had this false flag in which a Serbian shot down the Crown Prince of Austria and Hungary. Well, let's assume that the prince really died, but okay, that's how they did it. There was contention and then made use of the contention. That's how they do it. Now, the Serbians during that time were not smart because it was known that they had issues against the Austro-Hungarian Empire. So when the wizards took advantage of their antagonism by using a Serbian to initiate World War I, they received the blame. Because here's the thing, the Serbians back then did not examine carefully what they were up against. They thought, oh, the Austro-Hungarian Empire is an old-fashioned empire divided in several kingdoms. So it's very ineffective, the industry is quite slow, so we can handle this. Soon this will fall apart and we'll have our own state. Well, eventually they got their state, but not completely on their own. So they lost eventually, because they didn't properly study what we're up against. Now, that was an example of the Serbians during the end of the 19th century and early 20th century. But now I'm going to talk about more daily situations now. Anytime you realize that, or you sense you are the target of some group, realize that you are being endangered. Realize that there is something going on that can escalate. Realize that something's going on that can turn ugly anytime. So you ought to pay attention to what you're up against. Look, if you are a police officer and you're sent to arrest some criminals in the neighborhood, you will receive training beforehand how to arrest those people, how to handle the arrest. And you'll be informed about the type of neighborhood you will go into. And there are times the local authorities will prevent the police from arresting a suspect if the authorities see that arrest would cause more trouble. For example, let's say you have a ghetto somewhere in the Netherlands, let's say in Rotterdam, you have a ghetto over there. And let's say that in this ghetto, there's this anti-government sentiment is very high. If the police would say, okay, we need to arrest this Moroccan guy called Ahmed, so send the officers and the police wagons to arrest the guy. But then the mayor may say, no, you're not going to do that. Because the moment you arrest this guy, people are going to feel upset, they're going to feel attacked, and once they feel attacked, they will either turn on the police officers arresting this suspect, or they will begin to rage in the streets. So if you want to arrest this guy, you're going to do it, you have to do it a different way. In this case, the police will have to examine what they're up against, that means the ghetto, and realize how to manage it well. Hope you're following me now. If you have, now this is not really a war-like situation, but let's say you have people, you have a soccer team that needs to play against another soccer team. It's important to know, let's say you have two teams, Team A and Team B. Let's say Team A is from Brazil and Team B is from Venezuela. The Brazilian team, if it wants to win from Venezuela, they need to know the strengths and weaknesses of the Venezuelan team. Because if they don't know the weaknesses or strengths of the opposite side, how are they going to win that soccer match? They can't enter the soccer match in blind optimism. They can't enter in blind, I won't say courage, but they can't enter in blind arrogance, thinking, oh, we are the best, because we say so, we're going to win. No, they need to examine which of the soccer players are the best, what are the weaknesses, and how we're going to tackle them. That's how it goes. Now, another situation which is not really warlike, but let's say you have a company, a corporation, and they want the masses to get hooked to their product. They will examine the context of that society, and if they see that in this society there's a lot of domestic violence and therefore there is a lack of healthy femininity, then they will make advertisements in which the longing for healthy female figures is triggered. And they will use this advertisement on that community. And the population who's exposed to this advertisement is provoked to long for healthy female figures. And the people are not aware that they're provoked in such a way. But without being aware of it, they become attached to the product of the corporation. Why? Because in advertisement, the pagan businessmen associated healthy femininity with their product. And because there's a need for healthy femininity, those the people in that population were hooked to that product. So it can be a laptop, or it can be just a car, or what it can be, maybe some biscuits they're selling. Doesn't matter what the product is. The people were hooked to the product by the pagan businessmen because those warlocks, they did their homework. They studied the community, and based on the data, based on the facts of the community, they made a policy. And that's why their policy was successful in hooking the population to their product. How do you think Prada, Gucci, Versace, Victoria's Secret, or Apple, Microsoft, or Shell, British Petroleum, how do you think those multinational corporations work? That's how they work. They conduct their research, they do their homework to know what they're up against. And that's why their policies work. Last time it means it's almost a month ago, I watched a short documentary on YouTube. It is a Dutch one. And they had social experiments. And they went on the streets in the Netherlands talking to the youth. That means people are like 15 years old, they'll, I would say, 25 years old. So they went to the youngsters. And what did you see? Most of those youngsters encountered on the streets, they had belts of 100 euros. They had maybe a jeans of 400 euros. Maybe they had an iPhone, which they paid 700 euros for. So if you would calculate how they were dressed, they were wearing hundreds of euros worth of clothing. Well, actually, the price they paid for those clothes. And when you look at it carefully, those clothes are just common textile with a logo on it. And one of the reporters asked, but can't you use that money for other stuff? One of the young said, yeah, but I want to get along, I want to live a good life. So that's how it goes. Human beings have this urge for harmony. They have this urge to get along with others. And the pagan businessmen, the warlocks that lead the business world, they exploit this natural need by associating peace and fulfillment with their products. So on a basic level, on an unconscious level, people are triggered to hold on to their products and people don't even know why. And that's why people end up making weird decisions, spending a lot of money, often money they don't have, on products they don't need. It works because those warlocks that run the business world, they know what they are doing. They know what they're up against. Those warlocks in the business world, or those pagan businessmen, they treat the masses as an enemy. The masses aren't really their enemy because they need the masses or else their products wouldn't sell, but they treat it as a warlike situation. And in a warlike situation, there is danger and you need to anticipate the steps of the opponent. That's how they treat the masses in their investigations. And that's how they manage to form effective policies to trap the masses. So in this video, I'm asking you, do you know what you're up against? Or are you operating from blind optimism? or blind pessimism, because you also have blind pessimism, in which people are so pessimistic without any factual basis. Pessimism is wrong, no matter what, okay? So there's no justification for pessimism, because pessimism harms your health. You have folks who are pessimistic just for sake of being pessimistic. They're going to explain why. You have such folks, but then you also have folks who are in complete denial and don't want to see any painful facts. Both are wrong, okay? And then you have folks who are so quote unquote intellectual that they can't see the bigger picture. Don't fall in any of those categories. Do you know what you're up against? You should know what you're up against. Look, if you don't know what you're up against, then every policy you'll make will be a failure, even if the policy succeeds. Why? Because if you don't know what you're up against, then you don't really know what you're dealing with. So if you make a policy, the policy may work, the policy may succeed, but a policy is intended to address a certain situation or to create a certain situation. Policies either address a situation or they create a new situation. So if you want to create a new situation, that new situation needs to be contextualized. There needs to be a proper context for that new situation. So if the new situation you want to create doesn't have firm roots, then that new situation will come. So the policy will succeed, but it won't last for long. So eventually the policy is a failure. Example given. Let's say there is a lot of crime in a community. Okay? And let's say that you have the local authorities, they want to get rid of it, so they come with a policy, let's put more police officers on the streets. Let's build more prisons. So anytime something goes wrong in the community, they have a zero tolerance policy, they put someone in jail. After 5 years, they've placed around 1,500 people in jail. And now it takes a lot, it costs a lot to maintain the prison system. So then one of the local leaders began to ask some questions. And he told the mayor, sir, this whole policy of zero tolerance, it's a failure. Because the purpose is to get rid of crime, to get rid of violence in the community. But the violence continues. The only thing we're doing is we're populating the prisons. But all those people, mostly men, to remove from the community, sooner or later will need to return to the community. And when they return to the community, how are they going to integrate after all those years? So actually, this policy is only giving temporary relief, but it doesn't work on the long term. In the long term, it would only bring more dysfunction. This zero tolerance policy is only giving emotional validation to the population, but it doesn't solve anything. Do we know what we're up against, sir? And then the mayor admits, oh, actually we don't. And then they hire anthropologists, sociologists, and those scholars conduct research, and they find out that there is a lot of stress issues amongst the population due to job insecurity. And this affects the marriages, it affects the families. And then, after reports come in, the mayor realizes, hold on a minute, people need to feel secure. It's this toxic insecurity that people are feeling collectively that causes all the violence. So we need to find a way to limit or reduce this toxic insecurity in the people. And then you have psychologists that are hired, and they say, build more cinemas, or build more clubs, build more entertainment centers, or build more malls. Because once you build malls, people are drawn to the malls, and urban life will be centered in the malls. And once urban life is centered in the malls, you have a better grip on the population. You know where they are. And at the malls, you can put cinemas and all of that, and the people have something to occupy themselves with. And because they're occupied with something, they're not faced anymore with their own insecurities. And this over time will exhaust the population. All that entertainment will exhaust the people, and they won't have any strength left to act out on one another. So they do it, and it works. The first policy, zero tolerance policy, was a very firm policy, but it was a failure because they knew what they were up against. They were only focused on the symptoms. They wanted to fight the symptoms. They had zero tolerance for the symptoms, but they had no view of what caused the symptoms, where the symptoms came from. They were not addressing the context. They wanted to have a new situation, but for a new situation to emerge, there needs to be a new context. You can't enforce a new context you can't enforce a new situation in an old context. Let me repeat that. You can't enforce a new situation in an old context, because the old context will sabotage or even harm the new situation. The same way, if you have an old situation, you can't enforce it in a new context because it won't match. Remember what Christ said about wine and wineskins. If you put new wine in old wineskins, because old wineskins are old, the new wine will go wasted. And Christ also said that people that often tasted old wine often want the new because they're accustomed to the old. So what Christ made plain there is that often people hold on to old contexts. People often hold on to the old context that doesn't work anymore, that has become dysfunctional, but because they are familiar with that old context, they protect the old context. And because they're protecting the old context, they don't have to do it knowingly, but that's what they're doing. Because they're protecting the old context, they are sabotaging any solution that will come their way. There are communities out there that don't recover because people are holding on to an old context. Let me give an example of an old context now. I often heard in my teenage years how the youth of today are out of line, they have no respect, blah blah blah. I later found out what respect really means, giving validation. And people often say that things were better in the old days. They often promoted the good old days. But when you go into the archives, when you look at the so quote-unquote good old days, there was a lot of dysfunction, a lot of domestic violence going on there that they didn't address. The only thing was that there was there were better restraints to hide the symptoms. Now that is the old context in which those people grew up. Now the new generation, the youngsters of today, they grew up in another context. In their context, there's more instant communication, and they're able to do things more on their own, which the previous generations did not have. So because the context is different, because the abilities have increased, now the old context is not proper anymore. But then you have a lot of older folks that hold on to the old context because that's what they're familiar with. And now they become now when dysfunction appears today, they're going back to the old context to quote-unquote fix the dysfunction of today. Now in the past, when there was dysfunction, they often sought relief from the symptoms instead of dealing with the root. So even then it was dysfunctional, but because it quote-unquote worked, they became familiar with it. But now, today, when you use those same relief mechanisms, it won't work. Why won't it work? Because you are dealing with another type of community. You're now dealing with a community in which the young folks are more able to do things separately from archaic authority figures. So now, you need to adapt to the situation and deal with the situation in a proper manner. But if you keep holding on to the old context, then you are part of the problem. Okay, let me give an illustration. I'm gonna give a few illustrations now. Let's say now it's the let's say it's the early 19th century, and you have this country, Chile, which was a kingdom under Spanish rule, and Chile separated, became a republic. In that republic, you had the nobles that wanted to hold on to their aristocratic titles and their privileges. But then the president of that republic tells them, hold on a minute. Those privileges that you had as nobles were there because Chile was a kingdom, part of the Spanish Empire. And as a kingdom, you guys were the stakeholders of the kingdom. But now, it's not a kingdom anymore, it's a republic. So now we don't have a central man whose ambition we are working out. Because that's what the kingdom is. You have a territory in which the ambition of a strong man is worked out. Now we don't have a strong man anymore. Now we have a coalition of wealthy families that needs to collide with one another. And I'm the president of this coalition. So you guys wanted to hold on to your aristocratic titles. You want to have a conservative attitude, but it's not proper anymore because the context has changed. We're not a kingdom anymore. We don't have Spanish supervision anymore. We don't have Spanish judges anymore to intervene when things go wrong. We now have to do it ourselves. You get this here? So now you had conservative, you can call them rich folks that wanted to hold on to the old context, even though the old context was not proper anymore. And in many Latin American countries, you had similar problems. But okay, let's go to another example. Let's say that it's the end of the 18th century, and there are certain places in Britain where they lay railways. Most railways were laid in the beginning of the 19th century. Let's say it's the end of the 18th century, and you have railways here and there. Let's say there's a railway from the south of England to Scotland. Now, let's say that in the south of England, you have a rich neighborhood where there was a lot of trade going towards Scotland. Before that, they had to use the ship. They had to sail ships to sail all the way to Scotland. Another way was through land. And through land, they would use chariots with strong horses. And let's say you have many horse breeders down there who breed strong horses for transportation by land, whether it's passengers you need to transport or mail or other cargo. Now you have this railway that has been constructed. So now what happens now is that the context changed. Before that, you needed strong horses to transport things by land, and would have taken maybe 5 days, maybe a week. Now that you have a railway, it may only take 20 hours to go from the south of Britain to the north. So now that you have this new context, you have more options. Now folks that want to send letters to Scotland can just pay a few pences and they can hand over the mail to a mailman on the train, and within 20 hours, or say within a day or two, the mail has arrived in Scotland. Now they don't have to wait 5 days before their message arrives in the north of Britain. Now, because there's faster communication, people have more options. Now they can visit relatives in the north. Now those who want to start their own business can trade more easily with the north of Britain. That means that those horse breeders that dependent on the relevancy of their strong horses need to adapt. They can still breed horses, but now they have to breed horses for competition and for recreation and for other purposes, because if they keep holding on to this context of them being like elite figures in the community, because they provide the means of transportation, if they hold on to that context, they'll go out of business and they'll end up in poverty. So those families that bred strong horses, they had to adapt to the new context. And such things occurred a lot in the early 19th century. Again, to enforce a new situation in an old context, it's not going to last. You need to be delivered from the old context. You ought to bring a new context, and in that new context, you can bring new situations. Yeah, this video has been over a half hour. I hope this video has edified you. I hope that you're learning from it. Just realize, enforcing new situations in old contexts won't work. But that is what worldly people often want to do. You have an old context that's not relevant anymore, or even if it's relevant because many people are holding on to it, because something can be relevant just because people hold on to it. If many people hold on to something, it's relevant because people are holding on to it. But just because it's relevant doesn't mean it's functional. Just because it's relevant doesn't mean it's a good thing. But if you have an old context that obviously needs to change into a new context where people don't want to change, yet at the same time they want solutions, those people are mentally ill. They are delusional. And another example I'm going to give, and I'm going to shut down this video. Let's say that you have a mass shooting that happened somewhere in the United States. And let's say you also have many gangs out there that are conducting violence. Then you have people in the 40s saying, you know what? If you would spank children more or beat children more to comply, this wouldn't happen. So now they justify child abuse because they think that abusing children or committing violence against children will hinder violence between adults later on. So hold on a minute. So you have people that conduct violence and you don't want violence. So now you're going to commit violence on children who can't defend themselves, who don't have any help. You're going to endanger them to teach them not to be violent. So now you're the one introducing violence to them. So you want to get rid of violence by introducing violence to reduce violence. That's a way of thinking that doesn't add up. It's a very sick way of thinking. But yet a lot of folks that are quote unquote conservative or traditional or old-fashioned, they have this weird way of thinking that they don't want to see how dysfunctional or how evil the thinking is. So they're holding on to a context, they're holding on to coping mechanisms that even in the old context was dangerous. But they don't even question the context they're holding on to. Do you know why some countries abolish the death penalty? Because they realize that first of all, it doesn't work, and secondly, it only extends the problem. Because before there was DNA tests, and before there were security cameras, it was very difficult to prove the guilt of a suspect. Often it was done on circumstantial evidence or based on eyewitness accounts. Now, some eyewitness accounts are also unreliable because they are colored by vested interests. So often in the past it happened that people were executed for things they didn't do. Now, if you already killed someone, you can't give them back their life. So now the community has to live with the trauma that they supported the murder of an innocent individual just to relieve themselves. And this is going to extend the violence. And this is going to extend the cruelty. So what are you going to do? You realize that capital punishment doesn't work and it only extends cruelty. So realize that you need to change this. So you develop a new context in which people don't approve of the death penalty, but look for alternative ways to deal with violence in the community. Just understand the following. If you understand this, and I'm very happy already. You can't make new situations succeed in an old context. You need to be delivered from the old context by generating a new context, and then you can bring many new situations. So deliverance is needed. Well, that's it for now. Keep agreeing with Christ and